Good evening, friends, and welcome to the United Lodge of Theosophists in Bengaluru. Today's topic that we're going to consider is cognitive and moral pitfalls. Now, before we begin, we'll consider a small excerpt from the Bhagavad Gita speaking about action. A quote here that you see under the title is from the part that we'll consider. Krishna is speaking in the 4th chapter, and he says, mankind was created by me of 4 castes, distinct in their principles and in their duties according to the natural distribution of the actions and qualities. Know me then, although changeless and non-acting, to be the author of this. Actions affect me not, nor have I any expectations from the fruits of actions. He who comprehendeth me to be thus is not held by the bonds of actions to rebirth. The ancients who longed for eternal salvation, having discovered this, still performed works. Wherefore, perform thou works even as they were performed by the ancients in former times. Even sages have been deluded as to what is action and what inaction. Therefore, I shall explain to thee what is action by a knowledge of which thou shalt be liberated from evil. One must learn well what is action to be performed, what is not to be, and what is inaction. The path of action is obscure. Now, we have clearly seen in the words of Sri Krishna that even sages are deluded as to what is right action. And so we should conclude from that we are all suffering in some degree from self-delusion of action, where we are currently conducting, performing actions we think are right, which are not right. That must be a given. If anybody thinks all of their actions that they're performing today are in the highest good, I would invite them to explain their philosophy here. The problem really is that it is twofold. There's a twofold problem here. First of all, there is, as Carl Jung said, perception is projection. Essentially, this is a predilection of all human nature to first make up certain beliefs and expectations in our head. And you project that expectation onto the objective reality of what's happening and interpret those events in the context of your beliefs. So perception is projecting what is within your head and you already believe to be true. We'll take a very general example, and I'm sure all of you will be able to think of specific examples of this general pattern, where if a person, let's say yourself, is truly convinced as to a certain course of action to the point where you have no self-doubt and you go perform that action. I think a lot of us would have done high conviction actions like this in the past, thinking this is the right course. Let's say the result is propitious and good. The belief that we have that we are fully justified in this course of action will color that result and say, see, I was right. Right? The action that I performed is correct. The results I'm getting is in conformity with my expectations. Let's say it is bad. You will still say, and this is called fundamental attribution error, you will still say, I was right in performing that action. Certain chance events didn't align as it should, and hence there is a false outcome. You still color that outcome with your fundamental belief that it was the correct action. almost nobody will go back and say, you know what, my motives for this action were incorrect, and hence the output was not what I desired. That is a very, very, very hard thing to do. Why? It is because the framework that you establish through which you view the world around you and interact is the belief system you already have. There is no other way to look at the world in 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 a clear-eyed way. Um, the analogy here is that the fish is unaware that it is in water. The fish doesn't see the water because it is in water. It is only through the personality that you're able to perceive and interact with your environment. And hence, it is very hard to zoom out of it and look at it as an objective thing in itself and analyze it. That is the specific problem. Now, let's zoom out a little bit. And accepting that we have perception is projection predilection, why is choosing action hard? Why do our belief systems impinge and come in the way? The first fallacy that we have to explode here is we believe that when we act, we take an account of facts, and those facts determine in some logical fashion what you should do. Almost everybody, when asked why are you acting a certain way, will point to a group of facts and say these facts uh, naturally conclude that I should act a certain way. The reality is all action are actually determined by values and not facts. What that means is you choose the set of facts on which you base your actions because there are an infinite number of facts. Think about it right now. How many true statements exist in the universe, right? There is an infinite number of statements that are true. They're all facts. But your action at a moment is singular. You can only do one thing at a time. So there's something called pigeonhole principle, where it means that a pigeon can only go in one hole, meaning if there are infinite number of facts and your action is only one, it means you are choosing a set of facts to act on. I'll give you a very trivial example. It is a fact that a tadpole becomes a frog. It is also a fact that it is 6:23 p.m. here. Which fact am I choosing to incorporate into my action now? I'm choosing the latter and not the former. While it is true, it is not informing my action in any way. So I have chosen to select this fact to base my action on. What made me choose it? I don't choose facts based on other facts. I choose facts because I value this fact more than the other fact. So all actions are based on values. This is a very important understanding that we have to internalize. That we are essentially choosing the facts. We are essentially completely in control and have full volition of what facts we choose and hence of the results. No group of facts in and of itself ever compels any action. I'll give you one more example. Let's say you take two scientists who agree on all the facts concerning, say, anthropology and psychology. Do you think they will raise their children in the same way? No, they will make completely different life decisions. They'll make completely different choices on how they raise their children. Why? If they all agree on facts, why are they acting differently? Because their value systems are different. So you have to understand that value is what determines your actions. And which values you choose is completely subjective. Facts are either true or not true. Values are graded. Everybody can come up with their own set of values. And hence, you're greatly susceptible in your action to cognitive biases and logical fallacies. Because the value set through which you're seeing the world is predetermined and hardly ever examined, right? Through that lens, you pick certain facts, choose your actions, and retroactively convince yourself that you acted based on some set of hard facts. Almost never is it solely based on facts. It's always based on values. Now, there's another problem. Even if we admit that values are what determine our action, it turns out that the world, the life, is full of competing values. Competing values. So, if you take, for example, a virtue such as compassion, only mercy and compassion would lead one to extreme folly. You have to balance it with justice. What is the just thing to do as well? You can take the example of, say, um, liberty, personal liberty. Everybody would say liberty is important. But at some point, liberty has to be balanced with impinging on the rights of others. You don't have liberty to impinge on somebody else's rights. That's where jurisprudence comes in. So there's always a balancing act. These virtues of others' concerns is itself considered to be virtuous. I have concern for others. But if it's too extreme, it impinges on your personal liberty, right? But if you think personal liberty is extremely high, it impinges on other people's concerns. You take any virtue, you will find a competing virtue like this. So if you say, I'm only going to live my life on a set of virtuous list of virtues, you'll never be able to navigate anything because these virtues compete against each other and you have to choose a path between them. When you're navigating your course is through competing virtues. And lastly, to make all of this more complicated, values evolve with society over time. And there's a great example of this. While I'm not a great fan of Nietzsche, he did make a great observation in his research on his paper that he wrote that is called Slave Revolt. Essentially, Nietzsche's observation was if you go to Aristotelian list of virtues, right? What Aristotle in his time considered to be desirable virtues to be embodied, you'll find things like nobility, courage, um, you know, beauty, and justice, everything of a kingly virtue, right? A kingly virtue, a princely virtue. And then what he considered to be bad, where depravity, what is not beautiful, what is unjust, things like that. And then what Nietzsche observed was that over time, he calls this the slave revolt. Whether such a revolt actually occurred in history or not is open to debate. But we have inverted those virtues over time, where we consider this type of princely virtues, right, of nobility, to be somewhat evil, right? We said the meek shall inherit the earth. It's not some courageous king who has this characteristic of uh, nobility and rich wealth and you know things that look very extroverted to us today. We've inverted it. We've made it evil, and we have said those that Aristotle would have considered to be bad, not necessarily evil. We've exalted that to be good. So he's basically saying that there has been some kind of a slave revolt where the slavish ideals were elevated over time, and these kingly virtues were considered to be evil. Whether this is true or not, his observation holds enough water that enough people agree with it, which means society has evolved those values. So finally, we come to this analogy, right? We have said that which on which you base your actions are values, that there are competing values, and values evolve over time. So then how do you act? Now let's take the analogy of a greenhouse. This is a bad attempt at a greenhouse outline. Let's assume that in this greenhouse, it's a closed system. There is no external, nothing coming in from the outside. Let's say no magical entities exist in this greenhouse outside of what's already in that system. Now, let's say this greenhouse is your cognitive space, right? The plants that grow in this greenhouse are the ideas that you allow into your mind. Some of them sprout, some of them become really big trees, some of them are shrubs, some of them just wither and die. There is some set of ideas, your belief system that exists within this greenhouse. That's you. Now, the first question we should ask ourselves is there a gardener in the system? Can there be a gardener? Think about what a gardener is to a greenhouse, right? A gardener is not the plants. He's not the laws of nature that are working within the greenhouse. He is a sui generis entity. He is not like anything that's in the greenhouse. He has full free will. He can do whatever he wants and change the greenhouse in any which way he chooses, right? Can such a gardener exist? Is the first question. This gardener is completely unencumbered from by the past, because for him to be a fully free agent, he has to be. If such a gardener exists, the question you'll ask is, where did that gardener come from? He couldn't have just magically dropped into the system. There must be some beginning for that gardener. Where did this gardener come from? Let's say he came from some prior cause, because causality is something we all agree. It came from some prior cause. Let's call that cause a seed, right? When a seed germinates and grows under the right conditions, it has to grow into a tree of its own nature and not into anything else, right? And hence, it can have no agency outside of what it is designed to do. Like a mango tree doesn't have agency to grow tamarind, right? So a sui generis, completely free agent, unencumbered by the past, kind of a gardener, cannot exist within a closed greenhouse. This is a very important idea. We all think we have some independent, completely free gardener in our head that can go change our mind space in whatever way that this gardener chooses. That you'll see cannot exist, because if a gardener exists, he's one of the trees or a plant within the greenhouse, because he must have a beginning. He must have come from some seed, which means he is limited to being some kind of an entity like a plant or a tree within this greenhouse. That is a very important concept, and we'll revisit this a couple of times. The idea is that for you to act, you have to be of the material on which you are acting. You cannot be of some ethereal, uh, this is the Descartes' self and non-self, right? So Descartes said mind is one thing and body is another thing, and mind acts on the body. That was his idea. And he said mind is immaterial. It has no extension. It has no substantiality from our perspective, and body has all of those things. Then somebody asked this very pertinent question, then how can mind go push the buttons in my brain to make it work? How does mind, if it's not material, induce the right electrical impulses in my brain to make me do things? It's like, how can a ghost drive a car? If a ghost is immaterial and a car is material, if it depresses its foot on the accelerator, it would go right through the accelerator. It cannot make contact with it. You need a solid substance to make contact and move another solid substance. This is the argument. So a sui generis gardener cannot exist. So we all make this analogy a lot, of there being a gardener and a patch, and you weed out things that you don't want and you plant the right things that you want. But it's only an analogy that cannot be stretched to the point of imagining that there is such a sui generis gardener in your head. That's the first fallacy. Now let's extend this analogy a little bit. I call this the seeker problem. Now, this greenhouse came with some seeds that pre-exists in that greenhouse. Let's say those are your mental deposits, your vasanas, your swabhava that you've got from your previous life. But there's also a large window in this greenhouse through which seeds and cross-pollination blows in, right? These are the ideas that you imbibe from your environment, from interactions with people. Now, when you have this large window, which is unobstructed, allows anything to come in, fall on the ground, take root and grow and sprout, you have what I call the seeker problem. Where if you go to YouTube today, and you look at the top hits, you'll probably see some new age guru saying, do some breathing and some kriya, and that's the way to go. That's a seed that you're allowing into your head. You are not screening anything. You're not analyzing that idea. You allow that idea to fall into your brain. It's like allowing any and every seed to fall into your greenhouse and allow it to germinate. I don't know, you see Sam Harris and he says something like Vipassana yoga meditation is the right thing. That's what you do. Or Jordan Peterson would say something like the biblical exegesis in psychological terms is the right way, and you go become a Christian. Whatever it is, you allow these ideas without examination in your head. You have this problem, right? You have all kinds of ideas getting into your head, and you have no basis of filtering them out. Now, there is an opposite problem, where you say all such external ideas that come into my mind space are conditioning, and what I want is to decondition myself. This is the J. Krishnamurti problem, where if you close out everything and you have this completely isolated greenhouse, what do you have inside? You have sterile ground. In the prior example, where you had open windows, you have essentially chaos. In this case, you have some sterile ground with no harvest to speak of. So if you say, I want to isolate myself, I don't know, energetically from people and ideas and all of this, you're essentially in this J. Krishnamurti problem of deconditioning yourself to the point of being a sterile, empty vessel. So the right approach seems to be that you have to filter in the ideas. You have to have some basis for allowing certain ideas through examination and letting it germinate. But what is that mechanism if we say a gardener isn't there to screen and choose the seeds? How do you do it? This is the main question, right? And here we come back to one of the discussions that we had in one of the prior talks, that really the correct way to imagine a gardener or analogously imagine a gardener is in this way. Within the greenhouse, there are a lot of seeds that are potentialities that exist on the ground. There is a grow light. Let's say the sun doesn't actually come into the greenhouse in this case. There's a grow light which you can move and illuminate any part of that ground. In this case, because the grow light is in the spot that it is in, what is under it has grown well, it has become a tree, and everything far away from it is withering and dying. Now you can move this grow light. You have free will in being able to move this grow light in any spot and let that light shine on that piece of land. And in whatever potentialities exist there will germinate and grow. Now, what is this green light from the analogy that we're talking about as this mind space being the greenhouse? Well, the light is consciousness. Where does consciousness come from? It doesn't come from the greenhouse itself. It comes from our higher self, from the kshetranya. And it is unaffected by the swabhavas that exist on the ground, of the tree, of the greenhouse. It is sui generis, but cannot act on it by itself directly on anything. Just like the sun doesn't directly come act on earth, this grow light cannot directly act on those trees. It shines its light for everybody, and the point at which that light is shone, there the potentialities will sprout and grow. But what is it that is moving this consciousness? It is will. Will, where does will come from? It also comes from our higher self. Will is not a force that is generated by the lower quaternary, by our kshetra. Kshetra is subject to will. Will comes from the higher self. It is a faculty of our higher mind. Of course, this will gets entrapped in the lower and is, let's say, usurped by our desires and used as such. But its source is the power of consciousness, the acting power of consciousness, as Robert Crosby says. Now, both of these come from our higher self and is not subject to the vicissitudes of the kshetra. Now, when you apply will on your consciousness, what do you get? You get attention. This shining of light on any part of the ground is basically you letting your attention dwell on some ideas. So here you have a gardener. How do you weed out ideas that you don't want? How do you allow ideas to grow and become full trees that give you fruits and harvest? You let your ideas or let your attention dwell on those ideas that you want to foster, and you do not let your ideas or attention dwell on those that you'd like to weed out. Is this a sui generis gardener that is a physical entity here, cutting down trees and immediately changing the ground? No, it is the movement of this light. Let's say I move this light all the way to the other side. Will I immediately start seeing the flowers come out? No, because your nature will only change slowly. Plato has this to say in Timaeus that nose persuades the receptacle. It cannot directly go change the receptacle. It persuades it, meaning it just like sunlight. If it moves to a different part, let's say I take a pot and keep it in the sunlight, it doesn't suddenly become a tree. It has to take its time to grow into a tree. In the same way, when you change your attention, when you change the center of attention to, let's say, a higher center, your nature slowly remodels itself in that nature. And all of your actions will come from there. Now, in this analogy, all of these shrubs and whatever is growing here is essentially your swabhava. And what part of your swabhava you activate is based on where you let your attention dwell. And your swabhava is what acts, and that harvest, we can say, is the action. Now, we are very used to saying action is sowing and results are reaping. That is true. But this is the first order of sowing and reaping. Where you let your attention dwell, you're essentially letting what has already been sown to germinate, and those things act, which is the first reaping. The second order is when those actions then have consequences through the law of causality. Now, have we made this whole thing up? Is there any sanction in any literature that we can bring to bear to convince ourselves that this is correct? Well, there is a very clear saying. There are actually many corroborative statements in Bhagavad Gita that speak about this, but one that speaks to this is the quote that we have here. In the 18th chapter, when Arjuna is completely convinced that he has to go fight, Krishna basically says this final thing where he says, even if you don't want to fight, because that's what he starts with. I don't want to fight. I don't want to kill my own family, right? Even if you don't want to fight, you will be compelled to do so by your nature. Compelled to do so by your nature. If Arjuna had the sui generis gardener in his greenhouse, why couldn't he just cut down the one tree that is going to fight and change his nature into, I don't know, a brahmana that doesn't fight? Why is his kshatra, his martial spirit still there? Because his nature compels him to do it. He may move his center of attention somewhere else, but that doesn't immediately change his nature. It slowly reforms if you do want to do that. And Krishna's saying here is that Prakritis Tvam Niyokshyati. Niyokshyati means niyati. It forces you, it impels you to act a certain way. Just like in the previous example, when we had the glass house, after all of these things have grown, your harvest is a natural consequence of what you've grown. You cannot change the harvest. There's another statement that follows right after. It says, even such action as that which you wish not to perform by reason of folly, because he says to want to act against your nature is folly. The Samskrita word used there is mohat, right? Through folly. If you don't want to act as your nature wants to act, you will be forced to perform action born out of your own swabhavajam. So this likes and dislikes as to immediately I want to either do this or not is through moha. It is you're deceiving yourself and saying, I don't want to follow my swadharma. This is the dilemma that Arjuna had. So let's come back to this analogy. Here, the primary folly that Arjuna had was he thought that that will can directly give you a fruit, that I can directly will myself into acting a certain way. And Krishna is saying, no, you have a certain swabhava. It's only the swabhava that acts. It will force you to act that way. Even if your desire is, I will not fight or whatever it may be, your will cannot directly give you action. It can only move this your point of attention, which slowly changes your swabhava, which will then act in a way that you may or may not want. Now, this is, I think, a very hard thing for us to understand and internalize because we're too used to thinking we have an idea of will that is completely free on this plane. You only have free will in where you let your attention dwell. Everything else is a consequence of that. If it's a very hard idea to internalize, but once you do, it is an epiphany. Now, let's look at some pitfalls in the context of what we've looked at. Now, these pitfalls, like we said, are self-delusions, right? In the analogy of the greenhouse, they are like luxurious plants that have a promise of a certain fruit on which you place all your attention, right? But actually, it is a poisonous weed. That's the analogy here. And these pitfalls are not, here we're not talking about, very blasé platitudes of, do this, don't do that, of vice versus virtue, because that we should already have enough understanding about. This, when we say pitfalls, we mean that which we think is right, but may actually not be so. Okay, so we'll explore a few of that in the background of the idea of this greenhouse, and we'll obviously not comprehensive. This is only a few illustrations that kind of through introspection the student found were quite surprising. The first we already spoke about, compassion versus justice. We've said this many times in our classes that emoting is not compassion. Sentimental emotions are not compassion. It's a very hard thing for us to internalize this, but we'll give a few examples and we'll see if everybody agrees on this. But essentially, the idea is that compassion without justice is simply virtue signaling. What that means is you find many people, for example, expressing compassion on events in the world that don't impact them, right? It is very easy for me to sit here and emote that Syrian refugees are severely impacted. Or when you're in the US, for example, this is very popular, where there's a lot of compassion for homeless people, right? But if somebody says, hey, I'm going to build a homeless, they call it a navigation center in your neighborhood, they'll all come out and protest and say, not in my backyard, right? It's easy to show compassion when you have no skin in the game, when you lose nothing in expressing that compassion. It is just free social status. That's what virtue signaling is. When I express deep compassion about something in which I have no loss for myself, I raise myself socially. Everybody will say, he's such a nice person, right? He's so compassionate. I am signaling virtue. Is that truly a virtue? That's in fact a vice, right? So we should be very careful about, do we truly feel compassionate to the point where you're willing to do something about it, which will hurt you to some extent, right? That is the real question. That's where justice comes in. And here we have to look at the aphorism of karma number 21, which clearly states this, that karma is both merciful and just. And our ideas of that which men call mercy and justice is defective, errant, and impure. Robert Crosby calls the kind of compassion emoting that we do mamby-pambyism, right? Sentimentalism. But here, one of the students, Stefan, who sometimes calls in, asked a very pertinent question in one of the talks, which was, so we do not have samyak darshana. We don't have complete knowledge as to what is the consequences of any action that we do. So how do we balance justice with compassion? And his idea was perhaps in the lack of full knowledge of the consequences of all actions in Samyak Darshana to holistically understand, right? That we should err on the side of compassion. Is that something we can accept? Now let's look at that. Now, it turns out one way to look at this is as in the idea of a blast radius, right? Meaning the larger the blast radius of your actions and decisions, the closer you should approximate to karma. You can sacrifice justice. So when you say, I will err on the side of compassion, you're saying we will sacrifice some amount of justice. We'll do some injustice to somebody. Now that's only okay if that injustice only accrues to you based on this that we read in Key to Theosophy. Now in Key to Theosophy, there's an entire chapter about self-sacrifice. And there, the primary rule that the teacher gives is you have no right to sacrifice what is not wholly your own. So if I'm making a decision of should I act in err on the side of compassion and cause some unknowable injustice to somebody else, that is not a decision I get to make. But if I am making a decision where I err on the side of compassion, and the only injustice that can ever happen from that action is to me, then you are fully justified in making such actions. So we look at a few examples that will perhaps help us, and we'll go through this, right? So example number one, a homeless person comes to you on the road and asks for some money. Okay, if you were in the US, you're almost 100% sure that any money you give this person is going to go towards this person buying some drugs and shooting up, right? Well, in India, we don't know what that money is going to be used for. There's probably, they say um, there's a whole mafia behind the begging industry, and it's used for all kinds of nefarious purposes. You don't know. So any money you give this person can indirectly, you will be partaking of perhaps some really bad karma. But in this case, even if you choose to err on the side of compassion and do give some money, or let's say you give some food or whatever it is, the only injustice that can incur is to you. There is no other side. It's not like your family is involved or some nation is involved. You are choosing to act in a certain way where the blast radius is largely limited to your actions and to you. Let's take another example, and this may be closer to home to those who work in some corporations. Let's say you're a manager. You have a team, and in that team there are a bunch of people and there is an underperformer that you have to lay off. Let's add on all kinds of poignant personal stories to that underperformer. His father recently passed away, his sister has to get married, he's the only breadwinner. Let's add in any amount of sentimental layers on this cake. What should you do? You want to lay this person off. He's the only breadwinner in this family. You are the manager. It's your duty to run a team that is the highest efficiency. What do you do? Now, in this case, we can discuss when we come to Q&A on this point. But in this case, erring on the side of compassion and allowing an underperformer to be in the team, not only is it injustice to everybody else because they have to carry the slack of this person, but there's also a broken window syndrome that if everybody sees an underperformer happily, coexisting with everybody else, the meritocracy is brought down. You know that you can just get away by slacking. The broken window syndrome means the whole team is eventually going to become really bad. It'll affect the company. all kinds of. So the injustice that you accrue is not to yourself in this compassion. So here, I would say that if you feel so compassionate about this person, fire this person and give him a few lakhs from your own savings. That is a choice that you can make, because the injustice is only accrued to you, not to the company, not to the people working in your team. This may be a not very popular opinion, but we can discuss this in Q&A. Let's take a bigger example. Let's take the example in 2015. Apparently, Angela Merkel, the chancellor of Germany back then, was extremely moved by compassion when she saw a little Syrian girl, refugee, at the border, and she opened the borders. She said, "We're going to welcome 1 million refugees in 2015," and it went down eventually, but never went back to the baselines, and allowed in a lot of people who added a lot of stress on the welfare state that Germany has. Crime increased. EU had to open their borders in concomitance with Germany being one of the biggest, largest members of the EU state. So was Angela Merkel right in doing that? Right? The decision she took affected the entire country and EU. Is that the right decision? Now, it's open to debate. Let's take the example of the masters. We'll modify the statement from one of the Spider-Man series a little bit and say, with great power comes great alignment to the law. The more the blast radius your actions have, the closer you have to approximate it to the law of karma, which is both merciful and just. You have to let this personal aspect of I will choose between compassion, I will choose who injustice is met to, out of the picture, the closer. And that's what masters do. If you can apply this theodicy to the masters and say, if they have so much power, why is there suffering in the world? Because they approximate themselves to the law of karma. They cannot just come down and help and save every single soul. Because karma is the just law. Okay, we'll quickly go through a few of these and then we'll close and we can maybe. Another popular pitfall that we all fall into is we think universality means uniformity, right? And there is this all men are created equal, which comes in the Declaration of Independence in the US Constitution. And that's not true. From theosophical study that we've seen, everybody has the same potentiality, but different actuality. If you go back to the proposition that we considered today morning, the 8th proposition says races of men differ in spiritual gifts as they differ in stature and so on and so forth. All men are not created equal. First of all, they're not created. They make themselves by their own karma. But all of those constituents are different. Everybody is actualized different parts of their potentiality. So all men don't think and act as you do. And you cannot project that. So going back to the greenhouse analogy, no two greenhouses are the same. They don't grow exactly the same crops, the same seeds, and so on and so forth. Another popular misconception, and we all fall for this because of conventionality. Affected virtues are vices, right? There is this popular saying that you should fake it till you make it. This is another one of those fallacies, right? We read in the light of the path that it is useless for a disciple to strive to learn by means of checking himself. That change has to proceed from within without. That in the greenhouse analogy, this fallacy is like having some show plant that bears no fruit, but you basically focus a lot on it because it looks really nice for other people who are around you. This is exactly the fallacy of virtue signaling, where you check yourself and make yourself look good on the outside, but within you don't really work on what is inside, the stuff within. Here, HBB has very strong words on social conventionality, and she calls it a congenital lie. Then we have this aspect which this student is very prone to, which I call virtuous paralysis. This is debilitation into inaction lest you transgress in some way, right? And here the master's words are very important. He says, he who does the best he knows in with the limited knowledge that you have, and what he can does enough for us, right? And there is a very great and somewhat funny story of Maricha in from Dream of Ravan, where Maricha is also very afraid that he'll transgress and incur some bad karma. So he does a lot of calculations. When Ravana comes to him and says, "Hey, I want you to become a deer and go, get Sita to come out of the Lakshman Rekha," he does this calculation in his mind. Okay, wait, let's figure out what is the best course of action. If I disobey Ravana, he's going to kill me. If a demon kills me, I don't know what my birth will be in the next life. But if I do agree to him, become a deer, go there, and Rama kills me, he's an avatara, I immediately achieve moksha. He does these kind of calculations, right? But all of that is for naught, because you're basically trying to trick your way into salvation, right? And it doesn't work for him. It will not work for us. Here, the analogy would be that you're focusing on the harvest. You're so focused on the fruits, the actions, that you forget to sow. You forget to till your land and make sure the right crops are in your greenhouse. Lastly, this is very important, I think, doubt versus certainty. We all see samshayatma vinashyati in Bhagavad Gita. Shakespeare says our doubts are our traitors, and so on and so forth. But here, Master has this to say in one of the letters to AP Synod. This is very important. He says that he shares with all beginners, understand this, all beginners refers to us, the tendency to draw two absolutely strong inferences from partly caught hints and to dogmatize thereupon as though the last word had been spoken. The full truth, the last word on nothing has been given out. There are hints given out, and you're asked to try. You're not asked to not even. So here it says inferences. You're asked to draw inferences. You're asked to try to figure it out. But don't dogmatize on whatever you do and think that you've arrived at the last word, right? This, while you need to have certainty and not be given to doubt, too much doubt, this kind of doubting Thomas, right? You still need to have a healthy skepticism. You need to be able to balance these two virtues of certainty and healthy skepticism. Here, the analogy to the greenhouse is you have to be ready to weed out even the most luxurious tree in your greenhouse, the most confirmed idea, if it contradicts with your finding of some fact that you know to be true. In a lot of cases, we are wedded to our ideas. And even when we hear something that is more probable, more correct, we resist uprooting some really well-formed trees from our cognitive space. So finally, in summary, there is no gardener, there is no sui generis, fully independent gardener that can go around changing your mind space. You have to do it through attention, through the exercise of will on your consciousness. You have to look at balancing compassion with justice and not succumb to the temptation of compassion without a cost, which is basically virtue signaling. Universality is not uniformity. Everybody is different in their own way. The potentialities and the essence of everybody is the same. In actuality, there is incredible variety and differences. Affected virtues are vices, and do not succumb to virtuous paralysis. Do what you know and what you can, and that is enough for the masters. And finally, have to balance certainty with doubt and have a healthy skepticism. These are some of the pitfalls that we sometimes encounter even when we are well-meaning and conscientious.